Hey everyone, and welcome to the Locals episode 3. We have 3 of us here today, and I'll do some introductions in a moment. But today's podcast is going to be discussing a bit of an in-depth theory into who's on the beatdown, an article that was made in 1999, and its relevancy in today's modern metagame, and also as well as the actual game of Magic itself in 2024. And so today we've got myself, and we've also got Steve.
Yo, what's up?
And we've got Nick.
Yo.
So just the 3 of us today, and the article will be in the description of the video, so check it out on the ones that we're discussing. It's actually 3 articles that we've got here. But what we'll do is we'll give maybe a little rundown as to what the articles are talking about in terms of what the actual beatdown versus control is. So maybe, Nick, would you like to give our viewers a bit of a rundown on that?
Yeah, sure. So here's the beatdown classic article. Basically, it kind of distills the entire game in terms of matchups into 2 roles between the 2 players. One player as the beatdown or the attacker who's trying to end the game, and the other player, the control player, who's trying to prolong the game, basically. And the way that you can kind of determine who's who from like a heuristic point of view is who kind of like reaches a point of inevitability, or whether it be by like resource generation, a 1-card win situation, like a game state situation, anything where the beatdown player can't really play into, and so they have to try and avoid that situation by ending the game beforehand. That's kind of like a basic view of the theory. It has like expanded over the years, and there's been the sequel, Who's the Beatdown 2, Multitasking. I think this article is definitely a lot more in-depth when it comes to the theory. It kind of frames the Who's the Beatdown purely one-dimensionally in terms of the control player. And it basically argues that the most critical point of the dynamic between the beatdown and the control is the inevitability factor, in the sense that both decks have a point of inevitability where they're going to win the game, and whoever can arrive at that inevitability first determines who the control player is. Control in the sense that they're trying to maintain the stability, the status quo of the game to reach that point and therefore win the game. Whereas the beatdown, in this sense, which beatdown sounds kind of counterintuitive because a lot of the time they're not beating down. They're trying to disrupt the status quo, disrupt the flow of the game to prevent that from happening, to stop the natural progression and end the game.
So, like in other words, there's always going to be an inevitability that one deck will eventually win, whatever, if their win con or whatever it might be, that drags them over the line to a point where the other deck just can't keep up or fight through that. So one deck is trying to reach that point, and another deck is trying to win before that point gets reached. That kind of makes sense. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's kind of interesting. I think at the time it was fairly controversial in the sense that it kind of like reduces all the archetypes into Magic into 2, right? So like traditionally we have like combo decks, aggro decks, mid-range decks, whatever. But this theory is basically reducing all of that down to 2. You're either the beatdown or you're the control, which does muddy the waters a bit. Like if you think of matchups like combo mirrors, right? Like when one combo deck's playing into another, like how do you determine who's the beatdown there, or like who's the control? And it gets kind of interesting. But yeah, we can delve into it.
I think it is interesting because, like you said, like the way that the game has evolved from when the first article especially came out in 1999, there probably was more of a clearer kind of line drawn as to who's the control and who's the beatdown in a matchup in a specific game. Whereas now, because the game length has kind of reduced in terms of the power levels of each card and each deck that's being played, it's kind of difficult, I think, to kind of understand if you are on the beatdown or if you're actually the control deck in a particular matchup. And I think that's something that we can delve into today and kind of tease out a bit.
It's also very important to note that kind of this dichotomy between who's beatdown and who's control in a matchup is always going to be relative based on the matchup. Like, mid-range deck might be the beatdown against control deck, but it might be the control deck against a aggro deck, for example. So it's always going to be relative based on who has the inevitability. So the deck that doesn't have the inevitability is always going to be the beatdown, pretty much. So it's always relative to matchup.
100%. I think it's like extremely vague when we get to like these weird edge cases where I think like the roles of like beatdown and control, they seem like extremely counterintuitive, where there are situations where the control player could be the beatdown and the mid-rangey player could be the control in that dichotomy. And I think it's why using the terms beatdown and control are kind of weird. I think I more prefer framing the dynamic through like the idea of status quo. So you could have the inevitable player who's like preserving the status quo and like the disruptive player who's like disrupting the status quo. So like an example of this, which I've been talking about recently to some people, is Hammer versus Burn in Modern. I think what's interesting if you analyze this matchup through this framework is you kind of, if you've ever played the matchup, you'll understand that Burn kind of has to play the control deck in the sense that they're always holding mana and removal to kill the creatures that the hammer's being equipped on, right? Because once the hammer is on, the game's pretty hard to play, right? They just outrace you. So in that context, it kind of feels like Burn is the control player and Hammer's the beatdown. But I think like if you like analyze it strictly in terms of inevitability, the Hammer player is obviously the inevitable player because once they've equipped the Hammer, once they've equipped the Shadow Spear, that point is kind of inevitable. That point is inevitable relative to the Burn player in the sense that the Burn player cannot recover from that. So if, in terms of who's the beatdown, if Hammer is the control, the Burn player has to end the game before that point. So therefore making Burn the beatdown.
Yeah. And I think another way of thinking of it is like Burner doesn't necessarily have to, when we say beatdown, doesn't have to necessarily go all out to try and win that game straight away. They're just trying to disrupt the Hammer player from being able to get to that inevitability point where they're able to have control of the game by having a hammer or a shadow sphere on a big construct or something like that, where from then on it's almost impossible for the Burn player to win the game. So that doesn't mean that they have to try and win exactly on turn 4 because they've still got to play around, like you said, killing the creatures that do come out that do pose a threat, and they're disrupting the game of the Hammer Time deck. Because if you think about it in terms of like the Hammer deck can win on like turn 2 if it doesn't get disrupted, right? So the beatdown deck, in this case the Burn deck, has to make sure that it's disrupting it enough so it doesn't get to that turn 2 win, and then also doing enough damage to be able to kill it before it gets to the point where it has enough resources to be able to pull off its game plan.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Another way of like I think another way of describing disrupting is sort of like delaying that point of inevitability. You're delaying the opponent's progression into the inevitable state and giving yourself enough time to end the game before then. So even though as Burn, you're not getting closer to winning by spending your burn killing small creatures, but you're giving yourself more breathing room to reach that end.
Yeah, you're delaying that
goal.
inevitability.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So here's a question for you guys. Do you reckon that in this current meta, that this framework of thinking about matchups, do you reckon it's kind of universal in the sense that we could boil down every single matchup into these two archetypes?
Sorry,
In other words, like, can we think of a counter example where this doesn't hold true? Where we could have a matchup between two decks where the Who's the Beatdown kind of like crumbles.
I think that at the time, it was like pretty much a universal rule. Like, there's always going to be a deck that has inevitability, whether that be a combo or a control deck, and there's always going to be a deck that is trying to prevent that deck from reaching that inevitable point. While that kind of like idea can still hold true today, it can't be applied to every single matchup. Like, yeah, it can be applied to a majority of matchups, but there are some, like, usually pretty specific matchups that can't. Usually either like a mirror, whether that be like between the same deck, or like even like an archetype mirror, like a tempo mirror.
Do you have an example of like an archetype mirror?
Maybe
Where
like
this doesn't apply?
Murktide Rhinos. I think that's always it's always a matchup where like it's very like close who's beat down who's control in a matchup like that.
We'll definitely get onto that. We'll definitely analyze that matchup later on, but I think I would disagree. I think I'd say that I could make a pretty good case for one side being the inevitable play and one side not. But I think like what you're really like trying to get at is that I think the definition of inevitability is kind of vague. I think what you're trying to get at is that there's actually like degrees to inevitability, right? Like some decks could have strong inevitability and some could have a weak inevitability. So if in a particular matchup the inevitability is like quite weak, then it might not be a strong dynamic between the two decks, right? Is that kind of
Yeah, like for a combo deck, inevitability is like pretty obvious. It's once they start pulling off their combo. But inevitability for like a mid-range deck, for example, can look very different.
Yeah, I get that. So something like in standard right now, the meta's pretty mid-range heavy. There are a lot of mid-range decks that are pretty similar. So something like maybe like a Demir mid-range versus an Esper mid-range, where these archetypes are very similar. It would be like it would be pretty reductive to generalize the matchup into saying one deck has the obvious inevitable point through like a specific card, which just doesn't really exist, right?
Absolutely.
I think in that case you could use like a more granular approach and reduce the analysis by hand. So like we could like take both players' hands and then from there, just say like, oh well, this hand, like the Esper side, their hand is like all removal and resource generation, whereas the Demir's hand is all like 1-drops and 2-drops, like schooners, sirens, etc. Therefore, if the Esper side gets to resolve the resource generation, then they'll become the inevitable player.
Yeah, that links back to the original article, which says, I can't remember what it says exactly, but it states like usually the player that has more creatures is the beatdown. The player that has more like resource and card advantage is usually the control. So yeah, that kind of applies in that context.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question as well in terms of nowadays. Would you say a matchup or in a matchup, the control and beatdown roles could change between game 1, game 2, game 3, or even within the actual game itself or a match itself?
I think that's actually like 3 separate questions. I think those questions are: is the inevitable play is the inevitable player between the two players fluid in the sense that it can change mid-game based on new information or like new pieces of variance. Um, I think you're asking, can it change by play draw? So maybe play draw determines who's inevitable through like tempo or like the extra card draw for resource, etc. Or does sideboarding affect inevitability? Like, can a deck be inevitable, but the opposing deck have the perfect answer within the board that like nullifies that inevitableness?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Is that something that you think, changes the role within an actual matchup?
Yeah. So I think the sideboard one, I think that's the strongest case for having
Of
a
course.
dynamic inevitability. So like, I don't know, what's like an obvious example. So maybe like a matchup where Living End has inevitability, but then post board, here comes the Tormod's Crypts, and it's just like it kind of like changes. And now it's the Living End who has to deal with the Tormod's Crypt because the Tormod's Crypt is the point of inevitability.
Yes.
I think yeah. So you kind of like warping the inevitability of of a matchup from one side to like one specific card. So the inevitability hinges on that one card, and I think that's also an argument for describing how inevitableness can be fluid in a matchup. Maybe if the source of inevitability comes from specific cards. So like if a hand has Tormod's Crypt, it becomes the inevitable player. If a hand doesn't have Tormod's Crypt, it becomes the disruptive side or the beatdown traditionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I think within even that game, like if they have to use that Tormod's Crypt really early, and then the Living End player is able to start to gain control of that match, then that the player that played a Tormod's Crypt, like let's say on turn one, now they're in the beatdown role, I think, because now the inevitability changes back to the Living End player if they don't have something to disrupt them again, or to have that card that says, oh, you can't do what you want to do, because I have my Tormod's Crypt here. But if I have to crack it really early, like let's say, for example, by turn 2 or turn 3 they Tormod's Crypt, but they still haven't got the ability to close out the game, and then all of a sudden that Living End player, the next turn fills that graveyard again, and there's no way for that initial player to disrupt them anymore. Then I think it changes again within the game, and now they're on the back foot, and they're now the beatdown player. Sorry, and not the control player.
And I think that's one of the main flaws of the original article, is that like it's very cut and dry. Like before you even sit down, you have to like be able to determine who is beat down and who's control. But like kind of the realistic part of like a game that has so many variables is that like beat down and control can change like sometimes turn by turn. Obviously, like on a macro scale, it doesn't. But like you kind of get my point, is that like in a game with so many variables, like you can't really like say something so set in stone.
Yeah, like the theory behind the article, like it still rings true, but I think back then it was very, like you said, very cut and dry as to who was that control and who was the disruptive player or the beatdown player. Whereas now that is a bit more fluid and a bit harder as a player in yourself within a game to understand what role you're actually taking sometimes. So maybe we should break down maybe another matchup and see how that kind of.
Well, just on that, so are you like kind of getting at the idea that there's kind of like a disconnect between the abstract theory and like the real world practice of the game? Like
I
things
think
like
the theory holds true. Like I think that there definitely is that control player and the beatdown player, but the article, and correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of says that that's the role that you have for that particular game. Whereas I think sometimes within a game, that role can change these days.
Hmm. Do you have like an example of that? Because I think so I think when you say by like when you mean by like a turn by turn basis, it changing is that the idea of the inevitable player within a matchup is kind of like sensitive to like variance. Whereas
Yeah,
if you like look at holistically an entire deck list, you can easily point out, oh, there's this card in this deck, therefore they just have to play for this card, and obviously they're an inevitable player. But that doesn't account for like variance, obviously, right?
yeah,
It's like,
correct.
sometimes what if you don't have that card, or what if you have too many of that card, or like, et cetera, right?
Exactly. Or are they able to remove that card from your hand, for example? So then, therefore, that no longer bears true anymore, and you don't have that inevitability anymore. So maybe do you want to talk about the Murktide Rhinos matchup then? Because
Mm.
they're pretty similar in terms of like being tempo decks.
Yeah, so
Of course, the Rhinos have that combo, but I think that's probably a good matchup to talk about.
so Steve, you play Murktide. I
Mm.
play Rhinos and Murktide. Um, can you give your case for what you think the dynamic is? Or I think you alluded to before that like the inevitability is so like the degree of inevitability is small enough that it's irrelevant. Can you like give a case for that?
I
And
wouldn't say that
we'll
it's
see how
like
that lines up with what I think.
I wouldn't say that it's like small enough that it's kind of irrelevant. Like obviously, it's still you're still able to place a role on each player. Like one player is going to be the control in the matchup. So looking at the Rhinos Motide matchup, Rhinos I think is the inevitable deck uh, in this dynamic. So Rhinos is trying to resolve their Rhinos are trying to resolve their crashing footfalls through Cascade, and Murktide is trying to disrupt that like kind of game plan with counterspells, with removal, with interaction. So in that case, Rhinos would be inevitable, and Murktide would be kind of trying to disrupt that status quo. So Murktide in that matchup would be beat down. How do you feel about that kind of analysis?
Hmm. What do you think, Ariel, first of all, before I give my 2 cents?
I think it could be seen the other way around. I think you could see the Murktide player as the inevitable player because the longer the game goes, their Murktide is going to be the biggest creature on the board, and I don't believe there's a way for Rhinos to be able to remove that. Is that correct? You guys play the decks, so therefore, if they're able to get to that position, then they're more likely to win. So therefore, they're the inevitable deck, and the Rhinos deck is trying to um, get to their win con before that happens. So therefore, they're the deck that is taking on that more traditional beat down role. Um, that's my thoughts, anyways. I might be wrong, but that's what I'm thinking.
Um, I think I agree with you. Yeah, I think definitely. I think I can make a strong claim that Murktide is the inevitable deck because I think if you play as Rhinos, the issue with the matchup is okay. Well, first of all, defining the inevitable point. I think the inevitable point lies on Murktide's side when they get to the point in the game where A, they have delirium because this is pre-board, remember, so there's no endurances. A, they have delirium, and B, they have one or two EIs in hand, and they get to the point where they're cantripping EIs, and they're just getting all the answers and just answering everything that Rhinos has. I think on turn 3 or 4 or 5, whatever, Rhinos usually doesn't want to cascade into open mana, but they will always feel compelled to because they need to end the game before Murktide starts hitting their delirium, right?
Correct. Yeah.
It's the reason why the most important card, in my opinion, is pre-board at least, is the Darcy. I think the Darcy turn 1, turn 2 is really important on Murktide's side because it fuels your delirium rate like multiple times over than playing regular land go.
What do you
What
think
do you
now,
think?
Steve? With our thoughts on that, do you still think that Rhinos are the inevitable deck.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Just one more thing before you go, Steve. To your point about the inevitable point being Rhinos resolving two footfalls, I think once Murktide gets to the point where they're chaining EIs, they have at least a 5/5 Murktide or higher, and their unholy heats are online. I think they easily deal with resolved footfalls. I think it doesn't even matter because once you have one Murktide, it even if it only blocks one dude, unless you're on like really low life, the Rhinos play usually isn't trading damage to get one of like they usually aren't attacking with both their Rhinos, getting one of them killed to a block just to push extra damage, unless they are really compelled to. In which case like the game's probably over.
Yeah, I think I do agree with that. Yeah, this is like kind of why it's a little bit more difficult to analyze, maybe because I've been having trouble with the matchup. But yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that, looking at it through this lens. I kind of
I think
misunderstood
that's fair. Yeah.
the matchup, yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's what's so difficult, I think, as well. Like as a player, like you like that's your only modern deck, right, Steve? So you
Mhm.
play that inside out, but still you struggle to maybe think about where you fit within that specific matchup. And I think a lot of players do kind of feel that way as well. They might misread the game through that lens that we're talking about, and they might misread the game thinking that they're the one that have the inevitability, when in matter of fact it's actually the other way around, which then can lead to them making decisions that ultimately will make them lose the game because that wasn't the actual right decision to make at that point in time with this lens. Yeah, so it's something that's interesting, especially because like now it's so much power with all the cards that you're playing. It can change the whole flow of the game, and that's what I was kind of getting at before. Is that maybe there is some, I can't think of a specific example right off the top of my head, but maybe there are times when one card can change the role within that game.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think your point on like if you like only understanding one side or only having experience playing on one side, I think that's like a big deal. That can definitely mess up your interpretation of a matchup. I think maybe I have the benefit of like playing both sides of the matchup and playing not just both decks, but like playing the matchup itself from both sides. I think that's where I get a lot more. I think that's why I have a better intuition on the matchup. That being said, I do think there is like a reasonable argument for the Rhinos being the inevitable player, but I think Murktide just has all the tools in this scenario. I think EI is just a broken card, to be honest. It's too good. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about post board?
Yeah, I think post board,
Yeah.
post board it changes. Like Murktide is bringing in like EIs and charges to prevent the
Mhm.
cascade, and
How
Rhinos
does
wants
that
to
affect the
prevent that.
dynamic?
Rhinos is trying
Yeah.
to prevent that. So would that make
But also,
the
it
Rhinos
also matters.
inevitable?
Well, it matters on what's in the opening hand, I think, because if you don't have your sideboard cards,
Yeah, the sideboard cards
um,
are so important.
then really, you're not being able to be that role that you think you're going to be post game, right? You have to have those cards in hand, or they have to come relatively early on in the game for you to be able to then go, okay, well, now that this is on the battlefield, well, now that I have this in my hand, I have that inevitability that I will win the game because I can now take control of this game.
I
So
think
would
like there's an important distinction to be made when we're analyzing like pre-board, post-board, whatever. I think we can analyze it through like the actual game being played turn by turn, or we can analyze it abstractly as still conceptually like who is the inevitable player. So like even if let's say Murktide has Flusterstorm in their head, which is a killer card against Rhinos. It's brutal. Does that effectively still change who the inevitable player is in that case? Or if Rhinos has Endurance in their hand, another killer card, does that change who the inevitable player is? Or is that just a really efficient card that is really good against the opponent's game plan? Because there's like a subtle difference there, right? Like a card can be really good at stopping them, and it could win you like multiple percentage points in win rate by having it. But does that effectively still change the dynamic of the matchup? Because again, right, like the who's the beatdown? I think the core tenet of the who's the beatdown framework is it's irrespective of power level. So the framework used to analyze the matchup doesn't care about which of the two decks is a stronger deck, right? It only cares about which player is inevitable and how each side should play towards that factor.
Yeah, I agree.
So like if Rhino starts the game with like all of their hate pieces, like the endurances, the whatever, it makes them a lot stronger in the matchup and they're more likely to win the game. But does that affect the overall who's the beatdown like dynamic? Does that affect
change like the roles in the matchup?
Yeah.
So it would be correct to say that the roles don't change pre-board post-board.
Okay. So the only way it would change is if there is a specific if for the inevitable factor of one deck, there's a specific sideboard card that actually nullifies that point of inevitability, right? So
that completely changes the plan.
Like a ley line, for example. Let's say, for argument's sake, a ley line of the void gets played on turn 0 by the Rhinos player, and the Murktide player therefore loses the inevitability.
Exactly. Yeah, it turns off their delirium, turns off their big Murktide. They no longer have that capability of outgrowing the Rhinos' Rhinos.
Because all their cards require them to have that graveyard to be able to do what they need to do, and if without that, those cards reduce in their effectiveness, and also they're unable to navigate the game to get to their inevitability point because it's no longer existent.
Yeah, I think with that conclusion, I 100% agree. I think the dynamic is still the same. I think, like, to be clear, right, like this conversation is different from the conversation of who's winning, like who's winning between Murktide versus Rhinos. This is purely a thought experiment of this very specific, like, narrow framework of who's the beatdown. Yep, I think we're all in agreement there.
So is there another matchup that maybe we can delve deeper into and discuss? Who's on the beatdown, who's on the control, or who's the disruptive, and who's the inevitable?
I think an interesting matchup, would be Living and Burn, actually. I think that's one of those like interesting matchups where a specific hate piece in the sideboard can completely swing the dynamic of the inevitable player or the inevitable side.
So the inevitable side pre-board would be?
I'd say Living End. I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah. Living End will definitely be the inevitable deck in that regards against Burn. But post-board, you're saying that can change?
Yeah. Okay, so let's break it down. So pre-board, I'd say Living End is the inevitable player because when Living End resolves a Living End of sufficient size, the Burn player cannot beat it. They don't have enough removal to clear all the threats. Correct. Therefore, Burn is in the position where they have to end the game before Living End resolves. So Living End's the inevitable player, and Burn is the disruptive player. They're disrupting the game by ending it before it can happen. And then post-board, Burn has Rest in Peace, of course. And Rest in Peace shuts off Living End's graveyard. So what's interesting is that hate piece directly targets Living End's point of inevitability. And so I think that's an interesting case of, well, maybe now, assuming that Burn plays, assuming we analyze Burn through statistical averages, Burn assembles their win when they draw 7 lightning bolts.
Therefore, the Living End deck has to try and disrupt the burn player before that happens, that inevitability of them being burnt out, which
Yeah.
is difficult post-board because they have to play through that rest in peace that comes down. So they have to be able to disrupt that in order to disrupt the game plan of burn. So then burn has that control element in that game.
So I think like the interesting nuance with this matchup is both of the decks are extremely linear in the sense that they're both playing to enforce their point of inevitability, right? Like
Yes.
Burn wants to enforce their plan of drawing 7 lightning bolts. Living End wants to enforce their plan of resolving a large living end. So I think the way that we can like calculate these dynamics of who's the inevitable player when both sides are trying to be inevitable is who can reach their point of inevitability first, right? Living End pre-board is the inevitable player because they can reach their point of inevitability on turn 3. Whereas Burn, I think, at fastest, can reach at turn 4, right? I think Burn's a turn 4 deck. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So if we're comparing two decks that are extremely linear, the inevitable deck is the one that can go first, basically. And so the reason why Rest in Peace changes everything is it changes Living End from a turn 3 deck to turn whenever they can get rid of the Rest in Peace, cycle a sufficient amount, resolve, and then untap attack.
Yeah, and again, it's not necessarily meaning that game 1 Living End is going to win, because playing Living End myself, I find the game, like the first game, still extremely difficult to win as a Living End player, because the burn player can get you to a point where you're going to be dying to that one extra lightning bolt that they might draw off the top, even after you've got to your point where you've got your creatures from your Living End and you're ready to swing in. They might top deck, or they might have that last little bit of damage to get through. So it's like you said, it's different in terms of who's going to actually win the game. Exactly, but in terms of the lens that we're looking at, just for our listeners, I guess, is who has that inevitability and who doesn't in that particular
the framework matchup. The framework abstracts the power levels. It doesn't consider which deck is actually stronger than the other. Only the points of inevitability between the two.
I think this was kind of touched upon earlier, but in a matchup where both decks are inevitable or can be inevitable, play draw can matter a lot. So would you guys agree that like who's inevitable and who's not can be kind of dependent on play draw in a matchup like this?
I think that is one of those interesting cases where if we go by, again, like determining inevitability by who can arrive at the inevitable point faster, if the margins are so tight between the two decks that play draw does swing which side can go first with their plan, with executing their plan, then 100%. That could be a situation where play draw does determine who's the inevitable player.
But I think that's
not to say that affects this matchup. I'm not 100% sure because I just haven't played this matchup enough. But
yeah, I think that kind of idea of like play draw determining who's inevitable is like such a niche like corner case. I like can't even really think of a matchup where that can apply. Maybe like 2 combo decks and like Legacy, for example. But it's such a corner case that I can't really think of an example.
Well, probably examples would be like a mirror match, maybe.
Yeah.
Just thinking like
100%.
Yeah, like scam versus scam.
Yeah, or even like the burn mirror. I think the burn mirror is the most apparent, the most obvious example of this, where you're literally just trying to burn face, and by going fast, you're like inherently faster by 1 turn.
Yes.
Because if you end the game on your turn, you're effectively denying that turn. You're denying that extra turn the opponent would have had to draw an extra card and play an extra card.
Yeah, so I think mirror match is probably the easiest ones to to see that in theory happen.
So overall, I think like we've kind of been analyzing this idea of who's the beatdown from a more like descriptive lens, in the sense that we're analyzing the framework in the way that it can describe a meta or describe the environment that we play in. I want to kind of like get your thoughts on the more prescriptive element. Like, do we think that the who's the beatdown framework is good at prescribing advice to players? Because if you've read the original article, a bold claim that the author makes, Flores, is whether or not you can properly determine your role in the who's the beatdown matchup will, in a lot of games, determine whether you win or lose that game. So that's kind of like a really strong prescriptive claim, right? Like he's prescribing like theory. He's saying that this is what you have to do as a player. What do we think of that? Do we think that this idea is strong as a prescriptive element in this current meta? Do we think that it's, how important do we think it is to understand who is the beatdown and who is the control? And does it matter much in this meta?
I think that I agree with the idea of like the misassignment of roles leading to like maybe not necessarily a game loss, but it can definitely like really swing the advantage out of your favor. Like you need to know kind of what role you're playing going into a matchup. But yeah, like if you kind of misalign yourself with what role you're supposed to be playing, I think that's like a huge disadvantage in a matchup because you're going to be playing like completely wrong.
Especially if you've never played a matchup before. So like, if you haven't played that specific matchup, then not having that experience and not knowing that matchup can make you make the wrong decision in the game, because you might think you are the control player or the inevitable player. Maybe one example where I versed someone that I was on Living End and they were on Rhinos, and they were trying to get they were just going for the Rhinos on turn 3, not knowing that I was the more inevitable player in that matchup. So that was okay for me to let them be able to resolve that, and I had to make sure that I had the right cards to be able to make sure my living end went through, because I knew if I was able to do that, I would win the game. And this was against like a newer player, so they definitely assigned their role within that matchup, where they should have been definitely playing the opposite kind of role, or the opposite. They should have been doing something different. Sorry. In terms of what they were doing, I think they thought they were the inevitable player in that matchup when they weren't. But in terms of actually nowadays, some cards can like really get you back into the game and get you to, even if you've made like a mistake, it can maybe get you back into the game. But at the same time, if you make that mistake initially, the cards that your opponent has also can really punish you to the point where you can't come back as well. And I do think that not being able to recognize what role you are can be detrimental to your game. But like Steve said, doesn't necessarily mean that you have a game loss, but it can definitely
It's a massive
make
disadvantage.
make the game go the way that it wasn't supposed to go.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think like easy example is again with what we were talking about, Rhino's Murktide. Murktide is kind of that inevitable player. So I think when I was playing Rhinos around last year, and I was sort of like getting to that point where I was trying to get better at the game, I think an issue I had with the Rhinos Murktide is a lot of the times when Murktide was representing mana, I would just pass the turn, and I would just keep passing and passing, waiting for the opponent to tap out. But the problem is, good Murktide players, they're just never going to tap out. And eventually, the game went for so long that Murktide just reached their inevitable point, and I kind of just lost. And I think, looking back at that, I think evaluating the matchup from Here's the beatdown framework. I think I played that completely incorrectly. I think an inherent part of being the beatdown deck is you just have to take on more risk. Sometimes you just have to jam the cascade and hope it doesn't get counted.
Yeah, you've got
Or
to
hope,
get them to have the answer.
exactly, yeah. And I think me not fully grasping that idea is what cost me that game. That was at an RCQ too, yeah. But I learned my lesson. Sometimes you just have to go for it, and if they have it, they have it. But if you're on the side of beatdown, that's just how it goes. You have to take on the risk because you have to disrupt the flow of the game because you know that inevitably you're gonna lose if nothing happens.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So yeah, in general, I think it's 100% super important still. I think it's just as important back then as it is now. I think definitely when I'm learning a new matchup, very first thing I think of is, well, who's the beatdown? Am I, especially with decks like Rhinos, where it's very mid-rangey, it goes very back and forth, very matchup dependent. You really have to get that down. Um, yeah, you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
agree. I
agree.
think that it's still, like I said, we've always said it still holds true, but I think maybe nowadays it's not as easy to determine which one you are if you don't have the experience of those matches, and also it can also be determined on what what you actually have in your hand, and what is going to be played out in that first turn or two to determine, okay, yeah, they've got the answer or they don't have the answer to what I'm trying to get to. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion that we've had, and I think for anyone that's listening, hopefully you've been able to learn something, especially if you're a newer player. I definitely hadn't heard about or read the article before we kind of decided to go on it myself, but I think the way I see the game, I do see that the game in that lens. Just never really knew the kind of terminology for it, so it's been interesting to discuss it with you guys.
Yeah, I mean that's super
Yeah,
interesting. You're a really experienced player. You've been playing for what, like over 20 years now. So I mean, only just having read this like foundational article and learning about this theory for the first time is super interesting. Like I know that it's definitely helped me a lot. Like I'm kind of in the stage where like I think that I'm a decent player, but I want to work up to like being really good at like RCQs and stuff. And I think that theory about stuff like this is like really conductive to success. Like it really helps to enhance my knowledge. So yeah, it's a great article. It's a great like piece of theory.
Yeah, theory is always good, but I think experience does matter, and I think that's what I was kind of getting at. Like, I never really read all this theory before, but I think just my experience as a player, I've kind of understood like what I'm trying to do, and what my opponent's trying to do, and how I play around that, and what role I'm taking. And I never really knew that there was terminology to that. It was just more my experience as a player has led me to think that way.
Yeah, I mean that kind of approach to it is it's super interesting. I mean, it'll help you become a new player whether you've been playing for 20 years or only a few. I think
Correct.
that's kind of the beauty about it. That's why it's such a great
yeah.
piece of theory.
I think it's actually I think that's actually pretty common across a lot of people who are more like experience driven players where they kind of intuit like these ideas, but they've never really um actualized it in they haven't actually verified it or they haven't seen their actual thoughts written down on paper. I know Nick F, who we had on last week, I think he kind of said the same thing where um when he was reading the articles, he kind of thought of these ideas himself, but he hadn't fully fleshed it out until he read it. I think you're kind of getting at the same thing. Like in general, like the idea of attacker defender, beat down control. It's kind of intuitive, right? We kind of all get that sense. But yeah, to get it down in actual writing, to get that specific idea like explored to such depth, I think that's like the real value of theory.
Alright, well, if that nothing else to say there, like we said, the articles will be in the description. We hope that you guys got a thing or two from us, and hopefully we can apply this to our own games, and especially for those of us going to the RC in a couple of weeks from now. Actually, hopefully that theory has helped us maybe win a match, because we're able to determine which role we are better than our opponent. So from all of us, thanks for listening, guys. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. That'd be great. And until next time, this is the Locals.